While locals dismissed it as nothing more than eccentric canine behavior, Jack Miller knew his Border Collie's obsession with the rocky corner of North Pasture wasn't just another farm dog peculiarity. The persistent digging by Rusty, who refused to leave that spot despite countless attempts to distract him, would lead Jack to a discovery that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about Kentucky's Civil War involvement. 4 weeks of careful excavation following Rusty's determined pawing would unearth a sealed underground chamber that would transform not only the Miller family legacy, but reshape the entire historical understanding of Union gold movements during the final days of the conflict. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over Oakridge Farm, veiling the rolling Kentucky landscape in a dreamlike haze as Jack Miller began his daily rounds. The dew-drenched grass soaked the hem of his worn jeans as he trudged across the pasture, his calloused hands wrapped around a thermos of coffee that warmed his palms against the early autumn chill. Like his father and grandfather before him, Jack had devoted his life to cultivating the fertile fields of Clayton County, his weathered face and steady gaze reflecting decades of intimate knowledge of every acre under his care. The Miller homestead had weathered countless challenges through the years: droughts, floods, economic downturns, and the ever-present pressure of encroaching development from nearby Lexington. Still, the farm stood as a testament to 3 generations of determined agricultural stewardship in the heart of Kentucky's bluegrass region. This particular morning, however, would mark the beginning of a journey Jack could never have anticipated, one that began with the peculiar behavior of his most faithful companion. Rusty, the 5-year-old Border Collie who had been at Jack's side since he was a pup, trotted ahead with unusual purpose, his tail high and alert. Instead of circling back to help gather the cattle as he typically would, Rusty veered sharply toward the northeastern corner of North Pasture, an area Jack often avoided due to its rocky terrain that made cultivation difficult. "Rusty!" Jack called, his voice carrying across the misty field. "Come on, boy! Cattle need moving!" The dog glanced back briefly, brown eyes unusually intense, before continuing his determined path toward the rocky outcropping that local children had dubbed Witch's Corner decades ago. Jack sighed, attributing the behavior to perhaps a rabbit warren or groundhog hole that had captured the dog's attention. He'd correct the behavior later. The morning chores wouldn't complete themselves. By midday, with the cattle moved to fresh pasture and equipment maintenance underway, Jack noticed Rusty's continued absence, unusual for a dog trained to stay close to the farm operations. Concern gradually replaced annoyance as Jack climbed into his battered pickup truck and drove toward the North Pasture to investigate. He found Rusty exactly where he'd headed that morning, furiously digging at the base of the rocky outcropping, dirt flying from his paws in rhythmic bursts. The dog's usually immaculate coat was caked with mud, his determination evident in every movement. "What in tarnation has gotten into you?" Jack muttered, approaching the frenzied animal. Rusty barely acknowledged his master's presence, continuing to dig with single-minded focus. Jack knelt beside the deepening hole, expecting to find evidence of burrowing animals or perhaps an old fox den. Instead, his hand brushed against something solid beneath the loosened soil, something that didn't feel like the natural limestone. Formations common to the area. Brushing away more dirt, Jack's fingers traced what seemed to be a perfectly flat surface, too regular to be natural stone. Curiosity piqued, Jack returned to the barn for a shovel, deciding to indulge his dog's strange obsession for a few minutes before returning to the day's work. As he carefully expanded Rusty's excavation, the flat surface revealed itself to be worked stone, not the irregular limestone of local quarries, but precisely cut blocks fitted together with remarkable craftsmanship. An hour of digging exposed what appeared to be the corner of a manufactured structure deliberately buried beneath the rocky outcropping that had deterred farming equipment for generations. Jack sat back on his haunches, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool autumn air. Rusty, seemingly satisfied that his master had finally understood the importance of his discovery, sat proudly beside the excavation, tongue lolling. "What have you found, old boy?" Jack murmured, patting the dog's head. The question lingered as he stared at the buried stonework, his mind racing with possibilities. The farm's deed reached back to 1869, when his great-great-grandfather purchased the land after returning from Civil War service. Family law mentioned outbuildings and storage facilities that hadn't survived to modern times, but nothing about underground structures in North Pasture. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the field, Jack made a decision. Before mentioning this to anyone, even Sarah, he wanted to understand what he was dealing with. Whatever lay beneath the soil had remained hidden for generations of Miller farming. It deserved careful consideration rather than immediate exposure. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner in the farmhouse kitchen, Jack casually mentioned Rusty's unusual behavior, carefully omitting his own discovery beneath the dog's digging site. "That old rocky corner?" Sarah asked, her librarian's curiosity immediately engaged. "The one with all those stories about Civil War soldiers hiding out. Maybe he's found himself a rabbit warren." Jack paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. "What stories about soldiers?" Sarah smiled, accustomed to knowing historical tidbits. Her husband had never bothered to learn, despite living his entire life in Clayton County. Local folklore. Some old-timers used to claim that Union soldiers stashed supplies there during their Kentucky campaigns. Nothing substantiated, of course. The Historical Society has a few mentions in oral histories, but historians dismiss it as typical rural mythology. Jack nodded non-committally, his mind racing with new questions. The structure he'd uncovered was deliberate, crafted with skill and clearly meant to remain hidden. Could there be truth to those old stories? And if so, what exactly had Rusty discovered? The following morning, Jack rose before dawn, leaving Sarah sleeping peacefully. He told himself he was simply getting an early start on chores, but his footsteps led directly to the equipment shed, where he collected excavation tools before heading to North Pasture. Rusty, sensing adventure, trotted enthusiastically at his heels. The early morning light gradually illuminated Jack's careful work as he expanded the excavation, revealing more of the buried structure. What emerged was unmistakably man-made. A small but solidly constructed stone chamber with what appeared to be a sealed entrance. The craftsmanship was remarkable, especially considering its probable age. These weren't fieldstones roughly piled together, but carefully cut blocks that had maintained their integrity despite decades, or perhaps even a century underground. By mid-morning, Jack had exposed enough of the structure to confirm his growing suspicion. This was no ordinary farm outbuilding or root cellar. The precision of construction and the deliberate concealment beneath the rocky outcropping suggested purpose beyond simple storage. The entrance appeared to be sealed with a single massive stone slab that would require mechanical assistance to move. Stepping back to assess his discovery, Jack made a decision. This was beyond his individual expertise. He needed help to proceed safely and responsibly. Despite his instinctive farmer's privacy and wariness of outside interference, the historical implications demanded proper attention. His first call was to Earl Wilson, the elderly farmer whose family had worked neighboring land for even longer than the Millers. If anyone knew unrecorded local history, it would be Earl. The second call, made with slight reluctance, was to Sarah's colleague at the Riverwood Historical Society, Dr. Patricia Thompson. Earl arrived first, his ancient pickup truck bouncing across the pasture with surprising speed given its decrepit condition. The 82-year-old farmer approached the excavation site with keen interest, his weathered face creasing into an expression of vindication. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, kneeling with difficulty to examine the stonework. "My granddaddy wasn't spinning tales after all." Jack looked sharply at his neighbor. "You know something about this?" Earl nodded, slowly, running gnarled fingers across the precisely fitted stones. "Family stories passed down, but never proven. My granddaddy claimed his own father talked about Union soldiers constructing hidden storage chambers throughout this area in late 1864. Something about securing supply lines and protecting valuables during the final campaigns." He looked up at Jack, eyes bright with excitement. Nobody ever found proof, so historians wrote it off as fanciful recollection embellished over generations. Dr. Thompson arrived 30 minutes later, her academic skepticism visibly evaporating as she examined the structure. Her careful documentation and insistence on methodical approach tempered Jack's growing eagerness to see what lay within the preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sealed chamber. "This is remarkable construction for the period," she noted, photographing the stonework from multiple angles. "The technique is consistent with military engineering of the Civil War era, but the precision exceeds typical field construction. This was built by skilled masons with time and resources, not hurried soldiers creating temporary fortifications." By early afternoon, a small crowd had gathered at the site, Sarah having arrived with historical reference materials from the library and several members of the Historical Society bringing documentation equipment. Jack felt a growing unease as his private farmland became an impromptu archaeological site, but his concern about the discovery's significance outweighed his instinctive territoriality. Dr. Thompson established careful protocols for proceeding, emphasizing the need to preserve any potential historical artifacts. With proper equipment now on site, the team prepared to remove the stone slab sealing the entrance to the underground chamber. Jack insisted on being the first to enter, a right no one challenged, given his ownership of the land. As hydraulic lifts carefully shifted the massive stone slab, a rush of stale air escaped from the chamber, air that had been sealed inside for what they now suspected was over 150 years. The assembled group fell silent as the entrance was fully revealed, their flashlight beams penetrating absolute darkness. Jack, equipped with protective gear and a powerful headlamp, carefully entered the chamber. What he found inside exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. The space was approximately 12 feet square, dry and remarkably well preserved. Along the walls stood wooden shelving that had somehow survived the decades, and upon these rested several metal boxes bearing official-looking insignia. In the center stood a small oak table with what appeared to be documents still laid upon its surface, preserved in the chamber's remarkably stable environment. "Dr. Thompson," Jack called, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "You need to see this." The historian entered cautiously, her professional demeanor momentarily slipping as she surveyed the untouched Civil War-era time capsule. "This is unprecedented," she whispered, carefully approaching the central table. "A completely preserved Union military cache, untouched since placement." As they conducted an initial survey, the historical significance became increasingly apparent. The metal boxes contained Union Army payroll records, strategic documents, and most significantly, detailed accounting of gold shipments intended to finance the final campaigns of the war in Kentucky and Tennessee. The documents on the table included sealed orders from Union Command and what appeared to be coded correspondence related to covert operations in Confederate territory. One document in particular captured Dr. Thompson's attention. a letter signed by Colonel William Hawkins, Union Army Engineering Corps, dated November 1864. The letter detailed the construction of 7 secure repositories throughout Kentucky, designed to protect military assets from Confederate raiders during the war's chaotic final months. According to the document, this particular chamber was designated Repository 3 and contained records rather than actual gold or ammunition. This changes our understanding of Union logistics during the late war period, Dr. Thompson explained, carefully photographing the letter. Historians have debated how the Union maintained secure supply lines in contested territories. This suggests a network of hidden installations rather than conventional depots. As word of the discovery spread through Riverwood and beyond, Jack found himself thrust into unexpected prominence. Local media arrived by late afternoon, followed by representatives from the State Historical Preservation Office. By evening, his quiet farm had transformed into a hive of activity, with experts debating the significance of found documents and county officials discussing implications for historical designation. Sarah, observing her husband's growing discomfort, with the attention, pulled him aside as sunset painted the farm in golden hues. "This is bigger than us, Jack," she said gently. "Whatever Colonel Hawkins hid here was meant to be found eventually, to tell a story that's been waiting 150 years to be heard." Jack nodded slowly, watching as Rusty moved contentedly among the historians and officials, accepting treats and attention as his due reward for the momentous discovery. "I know," he acknowledged. "I just never expected our farm to become the center of a historical revelation." The following morning brought new complications as Jack received a call from Commissioner Regina Haze, informing him that an emergency county board meeting had been scheduled to discuss the Oakridge Farm, historical discovery, and its potential tourism implications. More concerning was the arrival of Victor Blackwell, the developer who had previously made unsuccessfully offers to purchase portions of Miller land for residential subdivision. "Quite the commotion you've stirred up, Miller," Blackwell commented, surveying the activity around the underground chamber. "Historical discoveries come with complicated regulations and restrictions. If this becomes too burdensome, my offer to purchase the property still stands, at a premium, given the circumstances." Jack's response was interrupted by the arrival of 2 black SUVs bearing government plates. From the lead vehicle emerged a man whose crisp attire and authoritative bearing immediately distinguished him from the academic and local officials. He approached Jack directly, presenting credentials with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Miller, I'm Special Agent Marcus Reynolds, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Historical Artifacts Division. The State Historical Office contacted our department due to the potential national significance of your discovery. I understand this is your property, and we intend to respect that while ensuring proper handling of what may be historically significant military documentation." The agent's arrival marked a turning point in the unfolding events. While Dr. Thompson and her colleagues had focused primarily on the historical significance, Agent Reynolds brought new perspective regarding national security implications of the discovered documents, even those dating from the 1860s. "Colonel Hawkins wasn't merely a military engineer," Agent Reynolds explained during a briefing in Jack's barn, now converted to a temporary meeting space. "Based on recently declassified Union Army records, we believe he was involved in counterintelligence operations during the Civil War's final phase. The documents you've discovered may include encoded intelligence that was never properly documented in official military records." This revelation elevated the discovery beyond local historical interest to potential national importance. Agent Reynolds requested permission to bring in specialized equipment and personnel to properly document and preserve the contents of the underground chamber. While emphasizing FBI respect for private property rights, he made clear the government's strong interest in the historical materials. As these events unfolded, Jack found himself increasingly pulled between competing interests: academic historians, eager to publish findings, county officials envisioning tourism opportunities, developers sensing vulnerability in potentially burdensome historical regulations, and now federal authorities asserting national interest in his farm's unexpected historical connection. That evening, after most visitors had departed with promises to return the following day, Jack sat on his porch, watching darkness settle over his family's land. Rusty lay contentedly at his feet, seemingly satisfied with the chaos his discovery had unleashed. Sarah joined them, setting a glass of bourbon beside her husband before taking the adjacent rocking chair. "Earl brought over something interesting from his family records," she said after a comfortable silence. "A photograph from 1869 showing your great-great-grandfather James Miller in his Union uniform standing with a group of soldiers. One of them is identified as Colonel William Hawkins." Jack turned to her, surprised. "The same Hawkins who built the chamber." Sarah nodded, sipping her own drink. "It appears your ancestor served under Hawkins in the engineering corps. When James purchased this land after the war, it wasn't a random selection. Earl thinks he deliberately acquired property containing one of the repositories he helped construct." The implication hung in the evening air between them. The Miller family hadn't accidentally farmed around an unknown historical structure. For generations, they had been unwitting guardians of a deliberately preserved piece of American military history, a connection that stretched back to the family's very arrival on this land. "He knew," Jack said softly. "James bought this farm, knowing what was hidden here, and chose to keep it hidden," Sarah added. "The question is why?" The answer began to emerge the following day as Professor Alan Davidson from State University arrived with specialized equipment to analyze the documents without removing them from their stable environment. His preliminary examination of Colonel Hawkins' personal journal, found secured in a metal case beneath the central table, revealed entries that transformed their understanding of the chamber's purpose. "This wasn't merely a military storage facility," Professor Davidson explained, carefully turning the journal's pages with gloved hands. "Hawkins describes it as a repository of truth, designed to preserve accurate accounts of controversial military actions that he feared would be expunged from official records after the war." The journal detailed Hawkins' growing concern about historical revisionism, even as the Civil War still raged. He had created the network of hidden chambers not merely for military security, but as a deliberate historical safeguard against what he feared would be post-war narrative manipulation. Repository 3, the chamber on Miller land, was specifically designated for documentation of covert operations and intelligence gathering that Hawkins believed would be stricken from public records due to controversial methods or politically inconvenient revelations. "Your ancestor James Miller is mentioned repeatedly," Professor Davidson told Jack, pointing to entries from late 1864. "He was Hawkins' trusted deputy, specifically charged with securing this repository and ensuring its contents remained protected. Until, as Hawkins writes, the nation is prepared to acknowledge complete truth rather than comfortable mythology." No. This revelation cast the Miller family's connection to the land in an entirely new light. Jack hadn't simply inherited a farm. He had inherited a multi-generational trust, a responsibility to protect historical truth that had passed unspoken through the family line. Whether this knowledge had been lost over generations or deliberately kept secret remained unclear, but Rusty's persistent digging had finally brought the truth literally to the surface. As Agent Reynolds coordinated with historical experts to catalogue and preserve the chamber's contents, Jack found himself contemplating his family's unwitting role in this historical drama. The documents revealed operations and decisions that even 150 years later challenged conventional historical narratives about Union activities in border states during the war's final phase. Commissioner Haze arrived mid-morning, her political instincts immediately recognizing the potential for converting historical significance into economic opportunity. "The tourism potential is extraordinary," she enthused, already envisioning brochures and guided tours. "With proper development, this could transform Riverwood's economic prospects." Victor Blackwell, never far behind when development opportunities emerged, presented Jack with architectural renderings for a Hawkins Historical Center that would require substantial portions of Miller farmland for parking, amenities, and infrastructure. "The county is prepared to offer significant tax incentives," he mentioned casually, "and my company would manage all development aspects, relieving you of considerable burden." The pressure mounted as various stakeholders positioned themselves to control the narrative and potential benefits of Jack's discovery. County officials spoke of historical tourism while eyeing tax revenue. Academics debated publication rights and research access. Developers circled with proposals that would fundamentally alter the farm's character and purpose. Throughout this swirl of competing interests, Agent Reynolds maintained a more measured approach, focusing primarily on proper documentation and preservation. During a quiet moment, when others were occupied with a newly opened metal box, he offered Jack an unexpected perspective. "Your family has been stewards of this historical record for generations, Mr. Miller, whether they knew it explicitly or not," he said. "That stewardship counts for something in how we proceed." That evening, Jack called a meeting of all parties in his barn. The competing interests gathered uncomfortably around hay bales and equipment. Rusty stationed himself prominently beside his master, occasionally accepting scratches from historians, who now regarded him as something of a canine archaeological hero. "I appreciate everyone's interest in what's been discovered on my land," Jack began, his farmer's directness cutting through academic and bureaucratic complexity. "But this isn't just about historical artifacts or tourism potential or development opportunities. This is about responsibility to history, to truth, and to this land that my family has worked for generations." He outlined his vision. The underground chamber and its contents would be properly preserved and studied, with appropriate historical designation that acknowledged its significance. However, this would occur within a framework that maintained Oakridge Farm as a working agricultural enterprise, rather than converting it to a commercial tourist attraction. Colonel Hawkins entrusted my ancestor with protecting these records until they could be properly understood. James Miller accepted that responsibility, as did the generations of my family who followed him, whether they fully understood what they were protecting or not. Jack proposed a compromise that balanced competing interests. A limited research facility would be established in the rehabilitated tobacco barn, providing controlled access for legitimate historical study. The chamber itself would be properly preserved but not developed as a mass tourist attraction. Most importantly, the farm would continue its agricultural operations, maintaining the character and purpose that had defined it since James Miller's time. "This farm isn't just land to be developed," he concluded. "It's a living connection to our history, agricultural and military both. The best way to honor Colonel Hawkins' trust and my family's stewardship is to maintain that connection while sharing the knowledge that's been uncovered." 3 months after Rusty's persistent digging first revealed the underground chamber, Oakridge Farm had reached a new equilibrium. The Miller Center for Civil War Documentation, housed in the renovated tobacco barn, provided controlled access for researchers studying the remarkable collection of previously unknown historical materials. Agent Reynolds had coordinated with the National Archives to ensure proper preservation while respecting the Miller family's continuing connection to the discovery. Jack, initially uncomfortable with the attention, had found unexpected satisfaction in understanding his family's deeper connection to the land they had farmed for generations. The historical designation came with easements and protections that actually secured the farm's agricultural future against development pressures, and the modest research facility operated in harmony with continuing farm operations. State University had established a fellowship program for studying the Hawkins documents, bringing scholars from across the country to Riverwood. Their presence created economic benefits for the small community without fundamentally changing its character through mass tourism. Even Commissioner Haze had eventually embraced the balanced approach, recognizing the sustainable benefits of controlled historical research over high-volume tourism. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 year after the discovery, Jack stood at the edge of North Pasture, watching the sun rise over his family's land. Rusty, now accustomed to his celebrity status among visiting historians, trotted contentedly beside him. The underground chamber, now properly sealed and preserved, remained a physical reminder of how history sometimes lies hidden beneath the surface of everyday life, waiting for the right moment and the right dog to bring it into the light. Sarah joined him, carrying coffee in ceramic mugs emblazoned with the Miller Center logo, her small concession to commemorating their unexpected journey into historical significance. Professor Davidson found something interesting in Hawkins. Later journal entries, she mentioned. Apparently, the other 6 repositories were designed to be discovered in sequence, with clues in each, leading to the next. They're still out there somewhere waiting. Jack smiled, watching Rusty sniff intently along the pasture's edge. Let's hope whoever's farming over them has a dog as persistent as this one, he said, scratching the Border Collie's ears affectionately. The farm continued its seasonal rhythms, planting, growing, harvesting, as it had for generations. But now those agricultural cycles were enriched by a deeper understanding of the land's historical significance and the Miller family's long, unknowing stewardship of truth buried beneath the Kentucky soil. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. The unexpected discovery on Oakridge Farm quickly attracted attention beyond Clayton County. By the end of the week, Jack Miller's quiet Kentucky farmstead had become the focal point of historical interest that extended far beyond local curiosity. The carefully preserved underground chamber, now referred to in academic circles as the Hawkins Repository, continued to yield documents of significant historical value as researchers catalogued its contents with painstaking care. Professor Davidson's team from State University established a temporary conservation laboratory in Jack's renovated tobacco barn, where they worked to preserve and digitize the fragile documents. Each new find expanded their understanding of Colonel Hawkins' clandestine operations during the Civil War's final years. The most significant discovery came on the 5th day of examination, a leather-bound ledger containing coded entries that Professor Davidson believed might detail the locations of the other 6 repositories mentioned in Hawkins' personal journal. The encryption is sophisticated for the period, Davidson explained, carefully turning the brittle pages under specialized lighting. Hawkins used a variation of a Vigenère cipher, but with modifications that suggest he anticipated potential decryption attempts by Confederate intelligence. As Jack watched the professor work, he couldn't help but feel a growing connection to his ancestor James. The photograph Sarah had discovered in Earl Wilson's family records now sat framed on their mantelpiece, a stern-faced Union soldier standing beside Colonel Hawkins, both men bearing the insignia of the Engineering Corps. What had once been abstract family history now had tangible presence, a direct connection to the secrets beneath his soil. Agent Reynolds, who had maintained a constant but unobtrusive presence throughout the cataloging process, took particular interest in the coded ledger. "The Bureau has specialists in historical cryptography," he mentioned. "With your permission, I'd like to have them examine digital copies of these pages. They might be able to decipher location information that could lead to the other repositories." Jack had grown to respect the federal agent's balanced approach. Reynolds demonstrated genuine concern for historical preservation while respecting the Miller family's connection to the discovery. Unlike county officials or developers who clearly saw the artifacts as means to their own ends, Reynolds seemed motivated by historical completion rather than personal advantage. "If there are 6 more chambers like this one, they should be found properly," Jack agreed. "Better by people who understand their significance than by accident or commercial development." As researchers worked to unravel the historical significance of the Hawkins repository, life on Oakridge Farm continued its seasonal rhythms. Jack still had crops to tend, equipment to maintain, and livestock to manage. Sarah balanced her library duties with increasing involvement in the historical documentation, her professional skills proving valuable to Professor Davidson's team. Rusty, now sporting a new collar with an engraved medallion reading "Historical Discovery Dog," divided his time between farm duties and accepting treats from admiring researchers. The media attention had subsided somewhat after the initial flurry of coverage, but Jack knew the respite was temporary. Commissioner Haze had been suspiciously quiet after her initial enthusiasm about tourism potential, a silence that concerned Jack more than her previous eager planning. His wariness proved justified when Sarah returned from work at the Riverwood Library with troubling news. "They've called a special county board meeting for tomorrow night," she reported, setting her bag on the kitchen counter with unusual force. "Regina's put forward a proposal for a Clayton County historical preservation zone that would encompass our entire northern property line, including North Pasture." Jack paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. "What exactly does that designation mean?" According to the draft proposal, it would grant the county oversight authority for any activities within the zone that might impact historical resources, known or potential. They're using the possibility of additional underground structures as justification. The implication was clear. Under the guise of historical preservation, the county was attempting to establish control over a significant portion of Miller farmland. Jack had anticipated some form of regulatory response, but hadn't expected such an aggressive move so quickly. "Victor Blackwell's fingerprints are all over this," Sarah continued, her librarian's research skills having traced the connections. 3 of the 5 board members who co-sponsored the proposal have received significant campaign contributions from his development companies in the past year. Jack nodded grimly. Blackwell's strategy was becoming clear. Unable to purchase the property directly, he was attempting to encumber it with regulations that would make continued farming difficult, potentially forcing Jack to reconsider his offers. It was a sophisticated approach to land acquisition, using historical significance as leverage for eventual development. The following evening, Jack and Sarah arrived at the Clayton County Administration Building to find the meeting room already packed with community members. The unexpected discovery had awakened local interest in history that extended beyond academic circles, with many Riverwood residents newly protective of what they now considered their community's unique historical asset. Commissioner Haze called the meeting to order with practiced efficiency, her political instincts evident in how she framed the proposed historical preservation zone. Clayton County has been blessed with an extraordinary historical discovery, she began, one that brings both responsibility and opportunity. The proposed preservation zone ensures we protect potential historical assets while developing appropriate educational and tourism resources for economic benefit. The technical presentation that followed emphasized phrases like responsible, stewardship, and historical protection, while glossing over the practical implications for land use and property rights. As Jack listened, he noted how carefully Haze avoided mentioning specific restrictions that would impact agricultural operations, focusing instead on hypothetical tourism benefits and educational opportunities. When public comments opened, Jack was surprised by the community response. Earl Wilson, leaning heavily on his cane, spoke passionately about agricultural heritage as Clayton County's most important historical asset. "You can't preserve history by preventing the very activities that created it," the elderly farmer argued. "The Miller farm isn't a museum piece. It's living history that continues every time a field is plowed or a crop harvested." Others followed, including several local business owners who questioned whether mass tourism would benefit Riverwood's small-town character. Even Dr. Thompson from the Historical Society expressed concerns about the proposal's scope, suggesting more targeted protections focused specifically on confirmed historical sites rather than speculative designation of large land areas. When Jack's turn came to speak, he approached the podium with the straightforward manner that had earned him respect throughout the farming community. "My family has stewarded this land for 5 generations, he began, his voice steady despite his discomfort with public speaking. "We've preserved not just soil and water, but the agricultural traditions that built this county. The Hawkins Repository survived 150 years under Miller family care without government oversight or tourism development." He acknowledged the historical significance of the discovery while questioning the expansive approach to regulation. "I'm committed to protecting the repository and supporting proper historical research, but designating over 60 acres as a preservation zone doesn't protect history. It prevents the continuing agricultural story from being written by the families who've always been its authors." As debate continued, Agent Reynolds unexpectedly requested permission to address the board. The federal agent's presence added gravitas to the proceedings, his measured tone contrasting with the emotional arguments that had preceded him. "The FBI Historical Artifacts Division appreciates local interest in preserving significant discoveries," Reynolds stated. "However, I must inform the board that federal authorities have determined the Hawkins Repository and its contents constitute materials of national historical significance under the Historical Preservation Act." A murmur ran through the crowd as Reynolds continued, explaining that federal designation would provide resources for preservation while establishing clear jurisdictional boundaries that respected continuing agricultural use of surrounding lands. The announcement effectively preempted the county's more expansive regulatory attempt, substituting targeted federal protection focused specifically on the repository itself rather than broad control over Miller farmland. Commissioner Haze attempted to maintain her political composure, but her frustration was evident as she called for a recess to review implications of federal involvement. As board members huddled in whispered consultation, Jack approached Agent Reynolds. "That was unexpected," he said quietly, "though I'm guessing not entirely unplanned." Reynolds allowed a slight smile to crack his professional demeanor. "The Historical Artifacts Division has been monitoring local regulatory responses," We've found that targeted federal designation often proves more practical than expansive local control, particularly when historically significant discoveries occur. On working agricultural land, he paused before adding, your family's long stewardship factored significantly into our approach. When the meeting reconvened, Commissioner Haze announced the county board would table its preservation zone proposal pending coordination with federal authorities on appropriate jurisdictional alignment. The political language barely disguised her retreat from a position that had suddenly become untenable. As Jack and Sarah drove home along moonlit country roads, the evening's events settled into perspective. Reynolds just outmaneuvered both Haze and Blackwell, Sarah observed. Federal designation trumps county zoning authority, and it's focused on the repository itself rather than our entire northern property. Jack nodded, hands relaxed on the steering wheel for the first time in days. It buys us breathing room. At least, though I doubt Blackwell will give up entirely, his prediction proved accurate. The following morning, Victor Blackwell's luxury SUV appeared at the farm entrance, the developer's expression betraying irritation beneath his practiced smile. Jack met him by the equipment shed, deliberately continuing to check fluid levels on his tractor while Blackwell outlined a revised proposal. The federal designation changes our approach, but not the fundamental opportunity, Blackwell explained, presenting glossy renderings of a more modest, historical interpretive center that would require only 10 acres rather than the previously suggested 40. We can work within federal guidelines while still creating significant tourism value. Jack wiped oil from his hands with a shop rag, studying the developer with newfound clarity. Mr. Blackwell, I've been farming long enough to recognize when someone's planting in soil that won't support growth. This land will remain a working farm, not a tourism attraction. Whatever historical significance the repository holds, it doesn't change my family's commitment to agriculture. Blackwell's accommodating manner slipped, revealing the calculation beneath. Sentiment is expensive, Miller. Federal designation comes with compliance requirements that will impact your operations whether you acknowledge it or not. My offer provides financial security while respecting the historical significance everyone seems so concerned about. I appreciate your insight into federal regulations, Jack replied evenly, but Agent Reynolds has made clear that designation focuses specifically on the repository itself, with minimal impact on surrounding agricultural activities. As for financial security, this farm has supported my family for generations without selling off its heritage. I expect that tradition to continue. As Blackwell departed, his frustration evident in his aggressive acceleration down the farm lane, Jack felt a rare moment of satisfaction in verbal sparring. The developer had underestimated both Jack's resolve and his growing understanding of the complex interests surrounding his discovery. That understanding deepened the following day when Professor Davidson made a breakthrough in deciphering Colonel Hawkins's coded ledger. The professor arrived at the farmhouse shortly after dawn, academic decorum overwhelmed by scholarly excitement. We've decoded part of the location system, he announced, spreading photographic enlargements of ledger pages across the kitchen table. Hawkins didn't use conventional geographic coordinates. He employed a brilliant system based on astronomical positioning combined with local landmarks, many of which no longer exist in recognizable form. Jack studied the decoded notations, impressed by Hawkins' foresight. He created a location system that wouldn't become obsolete even as the landscape changed. Precisely, Davidson confirmed, and we believe we've identified the location of Repository 4, approximately 12 miles northeast of here on what is now the Broadmoor Estate. The Broadmoor Estate was one of Clayton County's most prestigious properties, a former horse farm converted to a luxury housing development. 5 years earlier, the irony wasn't lost on Jack. Land that his ancestor had helped conceal historical artifacts on had been transformed into multi-million-dollar homes for wealthy professionals seeking rural scenery without agricultural reality. Victor Blackwell's company handled that development, Sarah noted, the librarian's penchant for community knowledge proving valuable once again. Extensive excavation would have occurred during construction. Davidson nodded grimly. If Repository 4 was there, it's likely been destroyed or emptied without proper documentation. That makes preserving the remaining repositories even more historically crucial. Agent Reynolds arrived that afternoon, bringing specialists from the Bureau's cryptography department who confirmed Davidson's partial decoding while making further progress on locating the remaining repositories. Their analysis suggested Repository 2 might be located on Earl Wilson's property, specifically beneath an area now covered by his equipment barn. The elderly farmer received this news with characteristic philosophical acceptance. Land holds secrets, he observed, when Jack and Reynolds visited to discuss investigation possibilities. Been farming for 70 years and still get surprised every season. If Colonel Hawkins left something under my barn, I reckon it's waited this long, wait till harvest is done before we start tearing up foundations. Reynolds, accustomed to jurisdictional complications, appreciated the farmer's reasonable approach. We can schedule preliminary ground-penetrating radar after harvest. No structural disruption unless we confirm something significant. As they departed Wilson's farm, Reynolds shared developments in the Bureau's broader investigation. We've identified descendants of Colonel Hawkins living in Virginia. They've provided family papers that shed light on his post-war activities and concerns about historical preservation. It appears Hawkins became increasingly worried about what he called convenient revision of Civil War history, particularly regarding intelligence operations. He created a backup history, Jack mused, preserved in stone and earth when he feared paper records might be altered or destroyed. Exactly, Reynolds confirmed. What's particularly interesting is that Hawkins seems to have recruited a network of trusted veterans, including your ancestor, to acquire strategic properties where repositories were located. None of the men ever revealed their knowledge publicly, but they ensured the land remained under stewardship of people who would respect its integrity, even without knowing precisely what they were protecting. This revelation transformed Jack's understanding of his family's connection to Oakridge Farm. What had seemed like fortunate agricultural opportunity, good soil and reliable water, had another dimension entirely. James Miller hadn't simply purchased farmland. He had accepted responsibility for protecting historical truth, a commitment silently honored through generations of Miller stewardship. As autumn progressed toward harvest season, activity around the Hawkins repository settled into structured research rather than frenzied exploration. Professor Davidson established a regular rotation of graduate students documenting and preserving artifacts, while Agent Reynolds coordinated with National Archives specialists on proper long-term conservation. The tobacco barn, converted to a climate-controlled research facility, became a quiet hub of historical scholarship. Jack and Sarah adapted to their farm's new reality, balancing agricultural operations with historical stewardship. The federal designation provided clear boundaries that respected farming activities while protecting the repository itself, along with modest funding for preservation expenses. More importantly, it established a buffer against county or commercial exploitation without fundamentally changing the property's agricultural character. Victor Blackwell made one final attempt at gaining control, approaching Jack with what he framed as a heritage partnership that would maintain farming operations while developing historical tourism infrastructure. When Jack declined, the developer, revealed his true perspective. You're sitting on a gold mine, but insisting on growing corn. That repository is worth millions in development potential. Jack's response reflected his evolved understanding of value beyond commercial calculation. Mr. Blackwell, that repository survived because this has always been a farm, not a development. Its worth isn't measured in tourism dollars, but in historical truth. My family has protected it for generations without knowing it existed. Now that we do know, that responsibility only deepens. Blackwell departed with dire predictions about regulatory burdens and missed opportunities, but Jack found himself increasingly comfortable with his decision to maintain agricultural primacy while supporting appropriate historical research. The farm's identity remained rooted in cultivation of soil rather than exploitation of history. The most profound moment in Jack's evolving relationship with his discovery came unexpectedly during a conversation with Professor Davidson about Colonel Hawkins's personal journals. The academic had spent weeks analyzing the officer's private writings, gaining insight into the man whose foresight had created the elaborate preservation system. Hawkins understood something fundamental about preservation, Davidson explained as they walked the perimeter of North Pasture. He writes repeatedly about the relationship between land stewardship and historical truth, how both require patience, commitment to future generations, and resistance to expedient compromise. The professor stopped, gesturing toward the rocky outcropping that had concealed the repository for over 150 years. In one entry from 1871, after repositories were completed, Hawkins wrote about selecting land that would likely remain agricultural because, in his words, farmers understand generational thinking, planting seeds whose full growth they may never witness, for harvests they may never see. Jack considered this insight, recognizing its resonance with his own experience. Farming had always oriented him toward future seasons, future generations, cultivating soil his children and grandchildren would someday tend. Just as he worked land, his ancestors had improved through decades of careful stewardship. Hawkins wasn't just hiding documents, Jack realized. He was planting them like seeds meant to emerge when conditions were right. Davidson nodded, and he chose his planters carefully, men like your ancestor who understood that some harvests require generations of patience. As autumn's golden light lengthened across the Kentucky landscape, Jack found himself increasingly at peace with the unexpected turn his life had taken. The historical significance of the Hawkins repository had brought complexity to Oakridge Farm, but hadn't fundamentally changed its purpose or the Miller family's relationship to the land. If anything, the discovery had deepened their connection, revealing layers of meaning and responsibility that had always existed beneath the surface of daily agricultural life. Sarah discovered additional family connections through her persistent research in county records. James Miller had married Elizabeth Hawkins in 1872, the colonel's niece, creating a family bond that further explained the transfer of both land and unspoken responsibility. This revelation completed a circle of understanding, showing how carefully the repositories had been entrusted to families committed to their protection. One crisp October morning, as Jack inspected the nearly mature corn in South Field, Agent Reynolds arrived with news about Repository 2 on Earl Wilson's property. Ground-penetrating radar had confirmed a subterranean structure consistent with Hawkins' engineering methods, located precisely where the decoded ledger had indicated. Wilson's agreed to careful investigation after harvest, Reynolds reported. If the structure remains intact, it could provide additional historical context for materials in your repository. Jack nodded, appreciating the agent's respect for agricultural priorities even amid historical discovery. Earl's family has worked that land even longer than mine. If anyone understands the balance between history and living tradition, it's Earl." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Reynolds shared the Bureau's broader perspective on the repositories. These discoveries represent an unprecedented preservation of primary historical materials. Hawkins created a distributed archive that survived precisely because it wasn't concentrated in conventional institutions or government facilities. Jack considered this insight, recognizing how it paralleled agricultural wisdom. "Like not planting your entire crop in one field," he observed, "distributing against risk." Reynolds smiled at the comparison. Exactly. Hawkins understood that centralized preservation, while efficient, creates vulnerability. By dispersing materials across multiple secured locations, entrusted to families with generational commitment to the land, he created resilience. Udil, the research facility in the converted tobacco barn, had become a respected center for Civil War scholarship, hosting historians from prestigious universities who traveled to Riverwood specifically to examine the Hawkins documents. Jack had initially worried about disruption to farm operations, but the academic visitors maintained modest presence, their focus scholarly rather than exploitative. Commissioner Haze had reluctantly adjusted her approach, abandoning tourism development in favor of educational programming through local schools. The compromise allowed her to claim political benefit from the discovery while respecting its primary historical rather than commercial value. Even this limited public access operated on schedules that accommodated farm operations, ensuring harvests and planting took precedence over historical tours. As harvest season reached its peak, Jack found himself reflecting on the year's extraordinary journey while guiding his combine through golden rows of corn. What had begun with Rusty's persistent digging had expanded his understanding of both history and his family's place within it. The repositories weren't simply hidden chambers, but testament to foresight that spanned generations. Colonel Hawkins, planning for future understanding, James Miller accepting responsibility for preservation, and subsequent generations maintaining stewardship without fully comprehending its significance. The evening after completing the corn harvest, Jack sat on his porch watching sunset paint the Kentucky hills in amber and gold. Rusty dozed contentedly at his feet, occasionally twitching in dreams that Jack imagined might feature heroic digging and historical discovery. Sarah joined them, bringing coffee and the quiet companionship that had sustained their partnership through years of agricultural challenges and now historical complexity. Professor Davidson found something remarkable in Hawkins' final journal, she said after comfortable silence. An entry from 1878, when he was elderly and reflecting on his preservation efforts. Hawkins wrote that he'd created the repositories not just to protect historical records, but to plant seeds of truth that would emerge when the nation was ready, to confront complete reality rather than comfortable mythology. Jack nodded, watching twilight shadows lengthen across his fields. He understood some harvests need generations to mature. And chose his fields carefully, Sarah added, her historian's appreciation evident. Land that would be worked by families who understood cultivation requires patience and commitment beyond immediate reward. As darkness settled over Oakridge Farm, Jack contemplated the layers of inheritance he'd received, not just soil and crops, but responsibility for truth preserved by generations of millers who had farmed this land without fully knowing what lay beneath their careful stewardship. Rusty stirred at his feet, the dog's unexpected historical contribution a reminder that discoveries often come from unlikely sources. The underground chamber, now properly preserved and protected, represented more than historical artifacts. It embodied a perspective on preservation that Jack increasingly recognized as aligned with agricultural wisdom, the understanding that some things must be protected not for immediate benefit, but for future generations who would need the nourishment of truth, just as they would need the sustenance of crops grown in carefully tended soil. "We're part of something longer than our own lives," Jack observed, the farmer's pragmatism infused with deeper appreciation for continuity. "Always have been, I suppose, but now we can see it more clearly." Sarah nodded, her hand finding his in the gathering darkness. Cultivation of different kinds, but with the same commitment to what comes after us. The repositories created by Colonel Hawkins had remained hidden until the moment was right for their discovery, protected by families who understood the relationship between land and legacy, between careful stewardship and future harvest. Jack Miller had begun the year focused simply on working his farm as generations before him had done. He would end it with deeper understanding of exactly what that continuity meant and the responsibilities it carried forward into seasons yet to come. Winter descended on Oakridge Farm with unusual severity, blanketing the Kentucky landscape in pristine white that transformed familiar contours into an alien terrain. The research facility and the converted tobacco barn maintained steady activity despite the weather, heated by newly installed systems that created a stark contrast between the clinical precision inside and the wild beauty of snow-swept fields. Beyond its windows, Jack Miller stood at the edge of North Pasture, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he surveyed the transformed landscape. The rocky outcropping that had concealed the Hawkins repository for over 150 years now featured a modest stone marker, the only visible indication of the historical treasure beneath the snow-covered ground. Rusty bounded through nearby drifts, his rust-colored coat collecting snowballs as he investigated scents hidden beneath the winter blanket. The season had brought natural pause to farming operations, allowing Jack to engage more directly with the historical research now centered on his property. Professor Davidson had established regular seminars in the research facility, bringing scholars from across the country to study the Hawkins documents and their implications for Civil War historiography. Jack often attended these sessions, his practical farmer's perspective sometimes offering insights that surprised the academics. Hawkins understood operational security in ways that seem remarkably modern, observed Dr. Eleanor Whitman from Georgetown University during one such seminar. His compartmentalization of information across multiple repositories ensured that no single compromise would expose the entire intelligence network. Jack, listening from the back of the room, found himself nodding in agreement. "Like planting different crop varieties across separate fields," he commented. "Protection against total failure if disease or weather targets one specific type." The scholars had paused, considering this agricultural parallel with newfound appreciation. Jack's understanding of risk management across generations of farming provided unexpected insight into Hawkins's strategic thinking about historical preservation. This morning's walk served dual purposes: checking fences that might have been damaged by recent ice storms and considering Agent Reynolds' latest proposal. The FBI had completed analysis of ground-penetrating radar results from Earl Wilson's property, confirming the presence of Repository 2 beneath the elderly farmer's equipment barn. Reynolds had suggested a coordinated approach to excavation, once weather permitted, creating a systematic documentation process that would connect findings across multiple repositories. The proposal made practical sense, but Jack recognized the deeper implications. Accepting formal coordination meant acknowledging that the Hawkins discovery extended beyond Oakridge Farm, becoming a regional historical project rather than simply a Miller family concern. The expansion felt both appropriate and somewhat wistful like watching a child grow beyond parental boundaries. The crunch of approaching footsteps in snow drew Jack from his contemplation. Sarah walked carefully along the packed trail he had created earlier, bundled against the cold, but determined in her approach. "Thought I'd find you out here," she called, her voice clear in the winter stillness. "Professor Davidson just got word from the National Archives. They've authenticated the Lincoln correspondence found in the repository. It's genuine, direct communication between Lincoln and Hawkins regarding intelligence operations in Kentucky." Jack whistled softly, understanding the significance. That confirms the repositories were officially sanctioned at the highest levels, not just Hawkins's personal initiative. Sarah nodded, her excitement visible despite layers of winter clothing. "It transforms the historical significance. These aren't just interesting Civil War documents. They're presidential records that somehow never made it into official archives." She paused, studying her husband's contemplative expression. "You've been thinking about Reynolds' proposal." It wasn't a question. After 22 years of marriage, Sarah could read Jack's considerations in his posture and expression. He nodded, gesturing toward the marker that indicated the repository's location. "Seems right that what Hawkins created should be understood as a whole, not just separate pieces," he acknowledged. "If these repositories tell a connected story, they should be studied together." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of an approaching vehicle, unusual given the weather and isolated location. Moments later, Agent Reynolds' government SUV appeared on the farm road, its four-wheel drive handling the snow with professional efficiency. The FBI agent wasn't expected until the following day, making his arrival noteworthy. Reynolds parked near the pasture gate and approached on foot, his usual crisp attire replaced by practical winter gear that nonetheless maintained a distinctly official appearance. His expression suggested news of significance rather than casual consultation. "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Miller," he greeted them with characteristic formality despite months of regular interaction. "I apologize for the unannounced visit, but developments required immediate discussion." Jack recognized the careful phrasing. Reynolds wasn't one for dramatic announcements or unnecessary urgency. "Something's happened with one of the other repositories." The agent nodded, brushing snow from his sleeves. "Repository 6 has been compromised. Construction crews uncovered a subterranean structure yesterday while excavating for a commercial development near Frankfurt. The developer attempted to keep the discovery quiet, but one of the workers posted photos online before being instructed to remove them." Sarah's historian instincts immediately engaged. "What kind of commercial development?" "Shopping center with luxury apartments," Reynolds replied. "Owned by Highland Development Corporation, a subsidiary of Blackwell Enterprises." Jack and Sarah exchanged glances, the connection immediately clear. Victor Blackwell's interest in the Hawkins repositories hadn't ended with his failure to acquire control of the Oakridge Farm discovery. "The timing suggests Blackwell has been pursuing information about repository locations independently," Reynolds continued. "Construction began at the Frankfurt site 3 weeks ago, with excavation focused precisely where our decoded coordinates place Repository 6. The implication hung in the cold air between them. Someone had leaked information about the repository locations, either from the research team or from within the federal agencies involved in the investigation. "What's the status of the site now?" Jack asked, practical concerns foremost. "We've secured it under federal authorization, but not before the entrance was breached and some materials removed," Reynolds acknowledged. "Blackwell is challenging our jurisdiction, claiming the discovery was made during legitimate construction on private property with all proper permits." The legal complications were predictable, but Jack's concern focused on the historical materials. "What was taken?" Inventory is incomplete, but preliminary assessment suggests documents related to Union intelligence operations in central Kentucky, including covert supply lines and safe houses, Reynolds replied. Potentially significant historical material, particularly when contextualized with findings from your repository. Jack considered the implications, snow crunching beneath his boots as he paced a short line. Blackwell's trying to establish a competing claim to the Hawkins legacy, financial leverage if he can't get direct control. Reynolds nodded agreement. The Bureau's assessment aligns with your conclusion. By establishing possession of materials from Repository 6, he creates negotiating position regarding research access, publication rights, and potential commercial development. Sarah, ever the researcher, focused on the broader implications. If Repository 6 has been compromised, the others could be at risk as well. We need to accelerate documentation of locations identified in the ledger. Precisely why I'm here, Reynolds confirmed. With your permission, we'd like to expedite ground assessment at all potential locations, beginning with Mr. Wilson's property. The weather complicates field operations, but specialized equipment can function despite conditions. Jack glanced toward the distant horizon, where clouds suggested another approaching storm. Winter had historically been farming's quiet season. Time for equipment maintenance, planning, and recuperation. Now it had become a race to locate historical materials before commercial interests could exploit them for profit rather than preservation. Earl's equipment barn has a concrete floor poured in the 1960s, he noted. You'll need specialized cutting equipment that won't damage whatever's underneath. Reynolds nodded. The Bureau has portable ground-penetrating units designed for archaeological applications, minimal surface disruption with maximum subsurface imaging. The decision wasn't difficult. Whatever reservations Jack might have had about expanded federal involvement were outweighed by the clear threat to historical preservation. You have my support, he agreed. I'll speak with Earl this afternoon. As Reynolds departed, promising to return the following day with specialized equipment and personnel, Jack and Sarah walked slowly back toward the farmhouse. Rusty bounded ahead, seemingly untroubled by the human complexities that had emerged from his simple act of persistent digging. Blackwell's been planning this since he first heard about our discovery, Sarah observed. The Frankfurt property. Acquisition predates Rusty finding the repository here. Jack nodded, understanding the implication. He's been collecting land with potential historical significance, speculative investment based on legends and rumors. It was a calculated approach, acquiring properties at normal market rates that could become exponentially more valuable if historical assets were discovered. The difference is intent, Sarah continued, her academic perspective bringing clarity. Hawkins created the repositories to preserve historical truth. Blackwell sees them as commodities to be leveraged for profit. The contrast crystallized Jack's resolve to ensure proper handling of the repositories. What Hawkins had entrusted to selected veterans and their descendants deserved respectful treatment, aligned with the Colonel's original purpose. Historical preservation rather than commercial exploitation. Earl Wilson received Jack's visit with characteristic philosophical acceptance, the elderly farmer sipping coffee at his kitchen table while considering the accelerated timeline for investigation beneath his equipment barn. Always figured something unusual might be under there, he mused, gazing through windows frosted with ice patterns. Floor never quite settled right. Slight depression in the northwest corner that collects moisture every spring. Jack explained. The situation with Repository 6 and Blackwell's apparent involvement. Earl listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing little beyond thoughtful consideration. Your granddaddy and mine farmed adjoining land for 60 years, Earl said finally. They understood something about holding things in trust for future generations. He nodded. decision made with the decisive clarity of someone who had spent decades making weather-dependent choices. Tell your federal agent he can start tomorrow. I'll move the essential equipment to the South Bay. History's waited long enough under my floor. The following morning brought renewed snowfall and the arrival of a small convoy of government vehicles carrying specialized equipment and personnel. The FBI team established operations in Earl's equipment barn with professional efficiency, converting the utilitarian agricultural space into a sophisticated archaeological investigation site within hours. Jack observed the transformation with mixed emotions. The technical capacity impressed him, ground-penetrating radar systems more advanced than anything he'd seen during the initial discovery on his own property, portable laboratory equipment, for immediate analysis of findings and communication systems that would connect the rural Kentucky investigation to historical experts across the country. Yet the scale of operations reinforced how far beyond simple farming the Hawkins legacy had expanded. Professor Davidson arrived mid-morning, accompanied by 2 graduate students carrying equipment of their own. The academic had evolved from initial scholarly excitement to a more measured approach that balanced historical significance with respect for the communities and families connected to the repositories. This acceleration changes our documentation approach, Davidson explained, as they watched technicians calibrate scanning equipment. We'd planned sequential investigation over months or years. Now we're looking at concurrent operations across multiple sites. Jack recognized the historian's concern. Rushing increases risk of mistakes or damaged materials. Davidson nodded. Exactly. These repositories have survived 150 years in stable conditions. Rapid excavation could compromise their integrity if not handled with extraordinary care. Like harvesting crops before they're ready, Jack observed. You get something, but not what was intended. The professor smiled at the agricultural analogy. Your perspective continues to provide valuable insight, Mr. Miller. Perhaps you could share that harvesting comparison with Agent Reynolds. He respects your judgment in ways he might not respond to academic caution. Jack found Reynolds supervising. Equipment setup. The agent's attention to detail evident in how he verified each system's calibration personally before approving operation. Jack explained the concerns using agricultural parallels that resonated with practical implications. Reynolds listened attentively, his expression thoughtful. Your point is well taken, the agent acknowledged. We'll adjust protocols to emphasize preservation over speed, even with the competitive pressure. Quality of recovery takes precedence over timeline. The modified approach proved immediately valuable when initial scans revealed that Repository 2 had structural differences from the chamber discovered on Oakridge Farm. While still constructed, with military precision, the underground space beneath Earl's equipment barn featured reinforced support elements and what appeared to be a divided interior, 2 chambers rather than 1. Hawkins adapted each repository to specific terrain and content, Professor Davidson observed, studying 3-dimensional renderings generated from the scan data. This design suggests heavier materials, perhaps ammunition or equipment rather, than primarily documents. The discovery validated the more careful approach, as hasty excavation might have damaged the modified structure or compromised its contents. Reynolds adjusted the timeline accordingly, extending the investigation a phase by 3 days before any physical penetration would be attempted. As technical teams established comprehensive documentation of the subsurface structure, Jack received an unexpected call from Commissioner Haze. The county official had maintained polite distance since her preservation zone proposal had been effectively superseded by federal designation, making her outreach noteworthy. Mr. Miller, I wanted to inform you personally about a development regarding Victor Blackwell's activities, she began, her political instincts evident even in telephone conversation. He's requested expedited rezoning for 3 properties in Clayton County, all within areas that your historical research suggests might contain these repository structures. Jack appreciated the commissioner's direct communication, recognizing it represented realignment of her political calculations. Thank you for the information. May I ask what position the county board is taking on these requests? Haze's response revealed her evolving perspective. The board has placed all 3 applications on administrative hold pending heritage impact assessment. Recent events in Frankfurt have raised concerns about proper historical stewardship. The commissioner's careful phrasing suggested she had recognized the political liability of aligning with Blackwell's development interests against emerging public sentiment favoring historical preservation. Her adjustment demonstrated the changing dynamics as community awareness of the Hawkins repositories grew beyond academic circles to become matters of local pride and identity. Jack shared this development with Agent Reynolds and Professor Davidson during their evening briefing in Earl's kitchen, where the elderly farmer insisted on feeding the entire research team with hearty stew that had simmered all day on his wood stove. The contrast between sophisticated technological investigation and rural hospitality created an environment that somehow honored both progress and tradition, appropriate for a project bridging 19th century history with 21st century discovery. Blackwell's pursuing multiple acquisition strategies simultaneously, Reynolds noted, accepting a second bowl of stew with appreciative nods to Earl. Property purchases, rezoning applications, and direct excavation where he already has ownership. He's determined to establish controlling interest in the Hawkins legacy. Professor Davidson considered the implications while warming himself beside the wood stove. The repositories were conceived as a connected historical narrative. Materials, distributed for security but intended to be understood collectively. Fragmented ownership fundamentally undermines Hawkins' purpose. Earl Wilson, who had listened quietly throughout the discussion, offered unexpected insight from his perspective as Clayton County's oldest active farmer. "Folks forget that land, remembers what people do to it," he observed, refilling coffee cups with casual hospitality that belied the significance of his words. Hawkins understood that private ownership with proper stewardship would protect these repositories better than any government declaration or institutional control. Jack recognized profound truth in the elderly farmer's observation. The repositories had survived precisely because they existed outside official channels, protected by families who valued land and legacy above immediate profit or recognition. Which is why Blackwell's approach threatens more than just access to historical artifacts, Jack concluded. It undermines the relationship between people and place that preserved these repositories for generations. The following morning brought breakthrough in the investigation beneath Earl's equipment barn. Advanced imaging had identified an access mechanism similar to the one discovered at Oakridge Farm, but with modifications that reflected the repository's different purpose. Technical teams worked carefully to expose the entrance without damaging the sophisticated 19th century engineering that had protected it for over 150 years. By afternoon, they were ready to attempt opening. Earl insisted on being present despite the cold that penetrated the barn, despite portable heaters. "My land, my responsibility," he stated simply, positioning his chair where he could observe without interfering with the technical process. The opening mechanism proved remarkably sophisticated, a counterweighted system that allowed the massive entrance stone to move with minimal physical effort once the proper sequence was engaged. As with the Oakridge repository, a rush of preserved air escaped as the sealed chamber was breached for the first time since the 1860s. Unlike the document-focused repository on Miller land, this chamber contained military equipment preserved in remarkable condition, rifled muskets still packed in cosmoline, ammunition in wooden crates bearing Union Army markings, and uniforms wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from moisture and pests. The second chamber, separated by an interior stone wall, contained communications equipment, including field telegraph sets and code books sealed in metal containers. An operational supply cache, Reynolds observed, with professional appreciation, designed to equip and support covert operations behind Confederate lines if necessary. Professor Davidson moved carefully through the space, documenting each item with reverent precision. The preservation is extraordinary. These artifacts provide physical context for the operational documents we found in Repository 1, the practical implementation of Hawkins' intelligence strategies. Earl Wilson watched from his chair, his expression thoughtful as researchers catalogued the military equipment stored beneath his barn for generations. "My granddaddy served with the 7th Kentucky," he noted quietly. "Always said the Union presence in central Kentucky was stronger than official histories acknowledged." Seems he wasn't exaggerating. The discovery beneath Earl's equipment barn transformed understanding of the Hawkins repositories, expanding their significance beyond documentary history to include material culture that illustrated how Union intelligence operations had been conducted in practice. The rifles, uniforms, and communications equipment provided tangible connection to the individuals who had implemented the strategies documented in Repository 1. As cataloging continued into evening, Jack received an unexpected call from Sarah, who had remained at Oakridge Farm to host a meeting of Historical Society members interested in educational programming. "Victor Blackwell just left our driveway," she reported, tension evident in her voice. "He arrived unannounced with what he called a cooperative preservation proposal, essentially offering partnership in developing all repository sites under unified management. When I declined to discuss it without you present, he left materials for review and said he'd return tomorrow." Jack shared this development with Reynolds as they drove back toward Oakridge Farm through gently falling snow. The agent's expression remained professionally neutral, but his response revealed concern. Blackwell's accelerating his approach. The discovery at Repository 2 likely convinced him that the historical value exceeds his initial assessment. Reynolds paused, considering implications. His proposal probably offers financial benefit while establishing his organization as primary controller of access and development. Jack nodded, hands steady on the steering wheel as he navigated slippery roads, converting historical significance into commodity he can package and sell. "Precisely," Reynolds agreed, while ensuring his development interest control the narrative rather than historical accuracy, determining appropriate presentation. Upon returning to Oakridge Farm, Jack reviewed the materials Blackwell had left. The proposal was sophisticated and superficially appealing, offering substantial financial compensation to property owners while creating a Hawkins historical network that would develop all repository sites under coordinated management. Careful reading revealed that this management would rest primarily with Blackwell Enterprises, with property owners and historical experts serving advisory rather than controlling roles. Sarah had already identified critical concerns in the document's details. "The intellectual property clauses are particularly problematic," she noted, highlighting sections with yellow marker. "They essentially assign all publication and presentation rights to Blackwell's organization, with academics and property owners receiving acknowledgement but no control over how historical materials are interpreted or presented." Jack recognized the fundamental issue immediately. Converting Hawkins' historical truth into commercial narrative. Exactly what the Colonel was trying to prevent by creating the repositories in the first place. They were discussing response strategies when Agent Reynolds received an urgent call from his bureau colleagues. The agent's expression darkened as he listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions that suggested serious developments. "Repository 5 has been breached," he announced after ending the call. "Located near Bowling Green on property recently purchased by Highland Development Corporation, Blackwell's subsidiary." Local authorities responded to reports of unauthorized nighttime excavation, but found legal permits had been obtained for archaeological investigation. The site was technically under private investigation before we could establish federal designation. The implications were significant. Blackwell now had possession of materials from 2 repositories, creating leverage in his efforts to establish controlling interest in the entire Hawkins network. His cooperative proposal suddenly appeared less like optional partnership and more like negotiation from position of strength. "This changes our approach," Reynolds acknowledged, professional composure masking obvious frustration. "The Bureau can establish jurisdiction over repositories with clear national historical significance, but the process requires documentation, with Blackwell establishing prior claim to Repository 5 through what appears to be legal channels. The situation becomes more complicated." Jack considered the developing situation with the practical assessment of someone accustomed to adapting to changing conditions. 7 repositories had been created by Colonel Hawkins and his network of trusted veterans. 2 remained securely under appropriate preservation protocols, Repository 1 on Oakridge Farm and Repository 2 on Earl Wilson's property. 2 were now under Blackwell's control, Repositories 5 and 6. Repository 4 had likely been destroyed during development of the Broadmoor estate years earlier. That left Repositories 3 and 7 still unlocated and potentially vulnerable. "We need to accelerate identification of the remaining locations," Jack concluded. "Not to rush excavation, but to establish appropriate protection before Blackwell can acquire control." Professor Davidson, who had arrived from Earl's property with the latest findings, offered academic perspective that aligned with Jack's practical assessment. The repositories were designed as complementary components of comprehensive historical documentation. Their value diminishes significantly if fragmented under competing control. Hawkins intended these materials to be understood collectively, with each repository providing context for the others. Indeed, the group worked late into the night, analyzing decoded coordinates from Hawkins' ledger and cross-referencing with current property records to identify likely locations for repositories 3 and 7. The process revealed Hawkins' strategic thinking. He had distributed the repositories across sufficient distance to prevent simultaneous compromise while ensuring each remained within territory likely to maintain agricultural character for generations. By morning, they had identified high-probability locations for both remaining repositories. Repository 3 appeared to be located approximately 20 miles southeast, on land now part of a state wildlife management area. Publicly owned property that offered potential advantage in establishing preservation protocols. Repository 7's coordinates suggested location beneath what was now the Riverwood Community Cemetery, consecrated ground that had remained undisturbed since the 1850s. The cemetery location was brilliantly strategic, Professor Davidson observed. Cultural reverence for burial grounds provides natural protection against development or casual disturbance. Agent Reynolds developed a coordinated approach for investigating both sites simultaneously while establishing federal protection to prevent Blackwell's intervention. The wildlife management area falls under state jurisdiction, which simplifies our access protocols. The cemetery presents more delicate considerations, requiring consultation with trustees and religious authorities. As these plans developed, Victor Blackwell arrived at Oakridge Farm precisely as promised the previous day. His luxury SUV navigated the snow-covered farm lane with determined precision, arriving at the farmhouse just as morning sunlight broke through cloud cover to cast long shadows across the winter landscape. Jack met the developer on the porch, deliberately establishing the encounter on his terms, rather than inviting Blackwell into the home where research teams had established temporary headquarters. Sarah stood slightly behind, recording the conversation, with photographers' attention to detail. "Mr. Miller," Blackwell began, extending his hand with practiced cordiality, "I trust you've had opportunity to review my proposal for cooperative development of the Hawkins Historical Network. As you've likely heard, my organization has secured additional repository materials that complement your initial discovery. Together, we can create something truly significant." Jack maintained neutral expression as he declined to shake the offered hand. "Mr. Blackwell, I've reviewed your proposal and found it fundamentally inconsistent with proper historical stewardship. The repositories weren't created for commercial exploitation, but for preservation of historical truth." Blackwell's smile tightened slightly, the only visible indication of frustration beneath his professionally maintained demeanor. Historical significance and commercial viability aren't mutually exclusive. My approach simply ensures sustainable funding for proper preservation and presentation, with your organization controlling interpretation and access, Jack noted, cutting directly to the central issue, converting Colonel Hawkins' carefully preserved historical record into whatever narrative proves most commercially appealing. The developer's expression hardened, pretense of partnership giving way to more direct approach. "The reality, Mr. Miller, is that my organization now controls materials from 2 repositories, with legal title and all appropriate permits. We'll be publishing findings and developing interpretive centers with or without your participation." Jack recognized the implicit threat. Blackwell would establish competing historical narrative based on materials from repositories 5 and 6, potentially undermining the comprehensive understanding that Hawkins had intended. "Here's what you've misunderstood from the beginning," Jack replied, farmer's directness cutting through corporate positioning. "These repositories aren't about ownership or control. They're about responsibility to history, to truth, and to the intentions of those who created them. My family has honored that responsibility for generations without even knowing what we were protecting. Now that we do know, that commitment only deepens." Blackwell studied him with calculating reassessment. "Principle is expensive, Miller. My organization has resources to develop these historical assets properly. Without coordination, you're facing years of regulatory complications and limited public impact." "Some things matter more than money or convenience," Jack responded simply. "Colonel Hawkins understood that when he created these repositories. The veterans who protected them understood it when they purchased land specifically to ensure their preservation. I understand it now as their descendant." The developer's expression revealed recognition that negotiation had failed. "You're making a significant mistake," he stated, business cordiality replaced by direct warning. "My organization will proceed with development of our historical properties, with or without your participation. Public narrative belongs to those who control presentation." As Blackwell departed, his vehicle's acceleration on the snow-covered lane, revealing frustration his professional demeanor had mostly concealed, Jack and Sarah exchanged glances that acknowledged the conflict had entered new phase. What had begun as historical discovery was evolving into contest for control of American historical narrative itself, precisely the dynamic that Colonel Hawkins had anticipated when creating his distributed archive of truth. "He'll accelerate efforts to locate the remaining repositories," Sarah observed, watching the developer's vehicle disappear down the long driveway. and begin creating his own interpretation of materials he's already acquired. Jack nodded, the winter sun warming his face despite the cold air. Which means our responsibility is clear. Ensure the complete historical record is preserved and properly understood, just as Hawkins intended. The winter sky stretched crystal blue above Oakridge Farm, silent witness to human complications arising from one dog's persistent digging months earlier. The repositories had remained hidden for generations, protected by families who understood land stewardship without fully comprehending the historical treasures beneath their careful management. Now, those secrets had emerged into complex modern reality, where historical truth competed with commercial opportunity and academic ambition. Jack Miller had begun the year as simply another Kentucky farmer, tending land his family had worked for generations. He would continue it as conscious steward of historical legacy that transformed understanding of how America's past had been preserved, and how its future understanding might be shaped by whose hands controlled that preservation. Spring arrived in Clayton County with explosive color, transforming the Kentucky landscape from winter's monochrome into vibrant greens punctuated by wildflower blooms that spread across the rolling hills like nature's own celebration. Oakridge Farm awakened to the season's promise. Fruit trees in the small orchard behind the Miller farmhouse erupting with blossoms that attracted honeybees from hives Jack had established 3 years earlier in partnership with a neighboring organic farmer. The seasonal renewal brought both agricultural demands and significant developments in what locals now called the Hawkins Affair. Winter's investigations had located all 7 repositories created by Colonel William Hawkins. During the Civil War's final phase, their status varied dramatically, from pristine preservation to complete destruction, creating a fragmented historical record that researchers were working diligently to reassemble into coherent narrative. Jack Miller stood at the edge of newly planted cornfields, gazing across acres of precisely aligned seedlings that represented both continuation of family tradition and adaptation to changing circumstances. The rich soil of Oakridge Farm had nurtured Miller crops for generations, but this season brought experimental approaches as Jack integrated some of Colonel Hawkins' agricultural observations from journals found in Repository 1. The Union officer had documented local growing techniques from the 1860s, including companion planting methods and natural pest deterrents that modern farming had largely abandoned. "Your great-great-grandfather would approve," observed Earl Wilson, who had arrived in his battered pickup to discuss recent developments. At 82, the elderly farmer moved more slowly than in previous years, but maintained sharp mental acuity and deep connection to agricultural traditions. Combining old wisdom with new methods, that's good stewardship. Jack nodded appreciation for his neighbor's understanding. Hawkins documented farming approaches I'd never considered. Seems he was preserving agricultural knowledge alongside military history. The observation reflected growing recognition that the repositories contained multidimensional historical record, not merely military documentation, but broader cultural preservation that included agricultural practices, social observations, and economic insights from the Civil War era. This comprehensive approach had been largely overlooked during initial excitement about military intelligence findings. Cemetery trustees approved the preliminary investigation, Earl noted, changing subject to the matter that had brought him to Oakridge Farm this morning. As respected elder in the Riverwood community, Earl had been instrumental in navigating delicate negotiations regarding Repository 7, believed to be located beneath the community cemetery. Jack appreciated the development, recognizing the careful community diplomacy it represented. That's significant progress. Did they specify conditions? Ground-penetrating radar only for now, Earl confirmed. non-invasive documentation with commitment that any physical investigation would maintain absolute respect for burial grounds. The elderly farmer's expression suggested both satisfaction with the agreement and continuing wariness about balancing historical discovery against community sensitivities. Their conversation was interrupted by approaching vehicle. Sarah, returning from Riverwood Historical Society, where she had been coordinating educational programming related to the Hawkins discoveries. Her expression as she parked and approached the men suggested significant news beyond routine updates. The National Archives made it official this morning, she announced without preamble. The Hawkins collection has been designated American Historical Treasure under the Heritage Preservation Act. Federal protection now extends to all identified repository materials, regardless of current ownership or location. Jack whistled softly, recognizing the implications. That changes Blackwell's leverage considerably. The designation represented culmination of coordinated efforts by Agent Reynolds, Professor Davidson, and historical preservation advocates who had worked through winter to establish comprehensive protection for the distributed Hawkins archive. The classification created legal framework that prioritized historical preservation and public access over private ownership claims, essentially preventing Blackwell from restricting or commercializing materials from repositories under his control. There's more, Sarah continued, scholarly excitement visible beneath professional composure. They've approved establishment of the Hawkins Center for Civil War Studies at State University, with satellite research facility right here at Oakridge Farm. Professor Davidson has been named founding director. This development fulfilled concept Jack had proposed months earlier, creating dedicated academic center that would connect the repository's contents while respecting their distributed nature and agricultural contexts. Rather than removing historical materials to distant institutions, research would occur where Hawkins had intended the repositories to remain, honoring both historical significance and continuing agricultural stewardship. Victor Blackwell has already issued statement challenging the designation, Sarah added, her expression suggesting she found his response predictable rather than concerning. His attorneys claim improper government intervention in private property rights, Jack nodded, unsurprised by the developer's response. Throughout winter, Blackwell had pursued aggressive strategy to establish controlling interest in the Hawkins legacy, alternating between financial inducements and legal threats as circumstances evolved. His acquisition of land containing repositories, 5 and 6, had been supplemented by extensive marketing campaign positioning Blackwell Enterprises as protector of Kentucky's forgotten Civil War heritage. Legal challenges were anticipated, Jack noted. Agent Reynolds said the designation was structured specifically to withstand constitutional scrutiny by balancing preservation requirements against ownership rights. Earl chuckled softly, the farmer's pragmatism evident in his weathered features. Blackwell still doesn't understand what he's really fighting. These repositories aren't just historical artifacts, they're trust passed through generations. You can't buy that kind of stewardship, and you can't create it with legal documents. The elderly farmer's observation captured essential truth that commercial interests consistently overlooked. The repositories had survived 150 years because they existed within relationship between people and land that transcended mere ownership. Hawkins had recognized this dynamic when entrusting his historical preservation to veterans who valued legacy above immediate gain. Commitment that had passed through generations of farmers who maintained connection to land and community despite changing economic circumstances. As spring advanced towards summer, activity surrounding the Hawkins repositories settled into structured research rather than frenzied discovery. The designation as American Historical Treasure established formal protocols for documentation, preservation, and access that respected both historical significance and property rights of current landowners. Jack Miller found unexpected satisfaction in this balance. His family's agricultural tradition continued uninterrupted while contributing to deeper understanding of American history. Professor Davidson established regular rotation of graduate students and researchers at the Oakridge Farm facility, their presence becoming a familiar aspect of farm operations rather than disruption. Jack occasionally joined their seminars, finding that his practical agricultural knowledge often provided unexpected insights into Hawkins' strategic thinking about both military operations and historical preservation. Hawkins understood that institutional systems sometimes fail, Jack observed during discussion about the Colonel's distributed preservation approach. Centralizing preservation creates efficiency but also vulnerability. Distributing materials across multiple trusted locations provides resilience against both intentional destruction and institutional neglect. The professor had nodded appreciatively. Exactly the principle that modern digital preservation specialists are rediscovering. Multiple redundant archives under diverse stewardship provide better long-term survival than any single repository, no matter how well resourced. This perspective informed development of the Hawkins Center's preservation approach. Rather than consolidating materials from multiple repositories into centralized collection, they established distributed research network that maintained historical materials in their original contexts while creating comprehensive digital access. The approach honored both Hawkins' strategic vision and the continuing agricultural legacy of lands where repositories had been located. Victor Blackwell maintained legal challenges throughout this period, but their effectiveness diminished as public sentiment increasingly supported preservation approach that balanced historical significance against private property rights. The developer's attempts to position himself as preservation advocate conflicted with his documented efforts to commercialize repository findings, creating credibility gap that undermined his legal arguments. The most significant breakthrough in understanding the Hawkins repositories came from unexpected source: investigation of Repository 7 beneath Riverwood Community Cemetery. Ground-penetrating radar had confirmed presence of underground chamber similar to those found previously, but cemetery trustees maintained appropriate restrictions on physical access given the sacred nature of burial grounds. After extensive consultation with religious leaders, historical preservation specialists, and community representatives, limited investigation was approved, using minimally invasive techniques designed to document chamber contents without disturbing surrounding graves. The process revealed that Repository 7 contained what appeared to be Hawkins' personal archives, journals, correspondence, and family documents that provided context for the military and intelligence materials distributed across other repositories. This completes the circle, Professor Davidson explained during presentation at the research facility. Repository 7 contains the personal narrative that connects operational documentation preserved elsewhere. Hawkins created comprehensive historical record distributed across multiple locations, each valuable individually but truly significant when understood collectively. The personal materials revealed Hawkins as more complex figure than initially understood. Beyond his military role, he had been educated scientist, agricultural innovator, and philosophical thinker deeply concerned about how Civil War history would be recorded and interpreted by future generations. His journals expressed particular concern about convenient mythology replacing complex historical reality once immediate participants had passed from living memory. "I established these repositories to preserve unvarnished truth," Hawkins wrote in journal entry from 1872, "not for immediate recognition, but for future generations who may find themselves confronting similar national challenges. When history is sanitized for political comfort or commercial appeal, we deprive posterity of wisdom earned through struggle and sacrifice." This philosophical foundation transformed understanding of Hawkins' preservation efforts. What had initially appeared primarily military documentation was revealed as broader attempt to preserve multidimensional historical record against what Hawkins feared would be post-war revision to support national reconciliation at expense of historical accuracy. Jack found personal connection to Hawkins' thinking during quiet evening reading journals provided in transcription by research team. The Colonel's concerns about historical preservation paralleled agricultural wisdom about maintaining genetic diversity in seed stock and protecting topsoil against short-term exploitation, recognition that immediate convenience often conflicts with long-term sustainability and resilience. Some truths must be preserved despite temporary advantage. In their concealment, Hawkins wrote, just as farmer must reserve portion of harvest as seed for future planting, rather than consuming everything for immediate satisfaction, society must preserve uncomfortable historical realities as seed stock for future understanding. This agricultural metaphor deepened Jack's appreciation for his ancestors' participation in Hawkins's preservation network. James Miller hadn't simply purchased farmland that happened to contain hidden repository. He had knowingly accepted responsibility for preserving historical truth through agricultural stewardship that would span generations. The connection between farming and historical preservation wasn't coincidental, but integral to Hawkins' conception of sustainable cultural memory. As summer progressed, the Hawkins Center established comprehensive digital archive integrating materials from all repositories that remained intact. Repositories 1, 2, 3, and 7 had been fully documented, with contents preserved either in original locations or appropriate conservation facilities. Repository 4 had been destroyed during previous commercial development, while repositories 5 and 6, under Blackwell's control, had experienced significant disruption before federal designation established protection protocols. The resulting historical narrative transformed understanding of Kentucky's Civil War experience, revealing sophisticated Union intelligence operations that had remained largely undocumented in conventional histories. Hawkins's detailed records of covert supply lines, counterintelligence operations, and strategic infrastructure planning provided new perspective on how Union forces had maintained control in nominally Confederate territories during the war's final phase. More significantly for broader historical understanding, the repositories documented extensive cooperation between official Union military operations and local citizens who supported federal cause despite living in Southern sympathizing communities. This complex reality challenged simplified narratives about regional loyalty that had dominated post-war histories seeking to promote national reconciliation. Hawkins preserved evidence of messy reality rather than comfortable mythology, Professor Davidson observed during academic conference held at the Oakridge Farm facility. These repositories document cooperation, resistance, and divided loyalty within communities and even families, complexity that post-war histories often minimized in service of national healing. This perspective attracted significant scholarly attention, with historians recognizing that the Hawkins repositories offered rare opportunity to examine how Civil War experience had been actively reshaped in historical memory during post-war decades. The Colonel's foresight in preserving contemporary documentation provided unique window into how complex historical reality becomes simplified narrative over time. process that continues in how societies remember and interpret their histories. Victor Blackwell made final attempt to establish controlling interest in the Hawkins legacy through sophisticated public relations campaign, positioning his organization as innovative partner in historical preservation. The approach suggested cooperation rather than competition with academic institutions, while attempting to establish Blackwell Enterprises as essential facilitator of public access to historical materials. "History belongs to everyone," Blackwell stated during carefully orchestrated media event at property containing Repository 5. "Our vision creates sustainable model that balances scholarly research with public engagement through thoughtfully designed educational attractions and digital access." The presentation featured architectural renderings of elaborate visitor centers at repository locations, complete with interactive exhibits, retail operations, and themed restaurants that would bring history alive for modern audiences. The commercial orientation remained evident despite language emphasizing educational value and historical authenticity. Jack Miller observed this development with bemused recognition of Blackwell's adaptability. The developer had pivoted from direct control to positioning himself as essential interpreter between academic research and public consumption. Strategy that acknowledged federal protection of historical materials while attempting to monetize their presentation and interpretation. "He's still missing the fundamental point," Jack observed to Sarah as they watched news coverage of Blackwell's presentation. Hawkins wasn't trying to create marketable experience, but to preserve historical truth, including uncomfortable realities that don't necessarily make entertaining exhibits or attractive marketing narratives. Sarah nodded agreement, her historian's perspective aligned with her husband's practical wisdom. Authentic engagement with history includes confronting troubling complexities and acknowledging perspectives that challenge comfortable assumptions. That rarely translates to commercially appealing visitor experiences. The contrast between competing visions for the Hawkins legacy came into sharp focus during Midsummer Community Festival in Riverwood. The annual event had expanded to include historical component, highlighting local connections to the repository discoveries. Rather than elaborate displays or commercial attractions, organizers had created thoughtful exhibits that connected civil war documentation to continuing agricultural traditions and community development. Jack provided antique farming implements from his family collection, displayed alongside contemporary equipment to illustrate both technological evolution and continuing agricultural principles. Sarah coordinated oral history project documenting local families' connections to land and community across generations. Professor Davidson's students created accessible presentations explaining historical significance of repository discoveries without simplifying their complexity. The approach drew surprising public engagement, with attendance exceeding organizers' expectations. Visitors expressed particular appreciation for programming that connected historical discoveries to continuing community identity, rather than treating them as commodified attractions separate from local context. People recognize authentic connection when they experience it, observed Dr. Thompson from the Historical Society, who had coordinated festival's historical components. They understand difference between history as living legacy and history as commercial product. This public response influenced county officials who had initially embraced Blackwell's development-oriented approach. Commissioner Haze, ever attentive to political winds, adjusted her position to emphasize community-centered historical stewardship rather than tourism development. Her revised perspective reflected growing recognition that the repository's significance transcended commercial potential, representing cultural heritage that required thoughtful preservation rather than exploitation. As harvest season approached, Jack found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with Rusty's persistent digging nearly a year earlier. The Border Collie, now sporting distinguished grey around his muzzle, still accompanied Jack during daily farm rounds, occasionally returning to the rocky outcropping where his curiosity had revealed historical treasure that transformed understanding. Of both Miller family legacy and broader American history, the farm itself had found new equilibrium, continuing agricultural operations while accommodating research facility that connected Oakridge Farm to national historical narrative. The arrangement honored both Hawkins's preservation vision and Miller family's agricultural legacy, maintaining productive balance between past significance and continuing stewardship. One crisp September morning, Jack walked with Professor Davidson along the edge of cornfields nearly ready for harvest. The academic had become regular presence at Oakridge Farm, his initial scholarly excitement about historical discovery evolving into deeper appreciation for agricultural context that had preserved Hawkins' repositories through generations. We've identified 17 families directly connected to Hawkins' preservation network, Davidson explained as they inspected nearly mature corn. Veterans who acquired specific properties containing repositories and passed them through generations, maintaining stewardship without necessarily understanding exactly what they were protecting. Jack nodded, surveying fields his family had cultivated since 1869. Continuity that commercial development interrupts. Blackwell sees land as commodity to be transformed for maximum profit. Farming families understand it as legacy to be sustained for future generations. The professor gestured toward the research facility visible across recently harvested wheat fields, its architectural design deliberately echoing traditional Kentucky agricultural buildings while incorporating modern research capabilities. That balance is what makes the Hawkins Center approach successful. We're not just preserving historical artifacts, but continuing relationship with land and community that protected them for 150 years. This perspective had influenced National Archives' decision to maintain distributed preservation approach rather than consolidating repository materials in centralized collection. Each intact repository remained connected to its agricultural context, with research facilities adapted to specific locations rather than removing historical materials to distant institutions. The approach honored both historical significance and continuing stewardship that had preserved Hawkins' legacy through generations. Victor Blackwell made final appearance at Oakridge Farm as autumn colors began to transform the Kentucky landscape. His approach had softened considerably from earlier confrontational positioning, suggesting recognition that direct opposition to community-centered preservation had proven counterproductive to his interests. "I'm pursuing international development opportunities," he explained during unexpectedly cordial conversation on the Miller farmhouse porch. "My organization is transferring properties containing repositories 5 and 6 to the Hawkins Foundation for appropriate historical management." Jack maintained neutral expression, recognizing pragmatic business decision rather than philosophical conversion. Blackwell had likely calculated that continuing opposition to popular preservation approach created more political and public relations liabilities than potential profit justified. Repositioning as cooperative participant would preserve his corporate image while allowing graceful exit from increasingly complicated situation. "The repositories deserve unified stewardship," Jack acknowledged, accepting Blackwell's apparent concession without unnecessary triumphalism. Colonel Hawkins created them as interconnected historical record, not separate attractions. The developer nodded, professional cordiality masking whatever disappointment he might feel about abandoned commercial opportunities. History takes unexpected turns. My organization recognizes the unique circumstances surrounding these properties justify specialized approach to preservation and public access. After Blackwell departed, Sarah joined Jack on the porch, watching autumn sunlight cast long shadows across fields where Miller crops had grown for generations. "That was surprisingly anticlimactic," she observed. "I expected more resistance," before he conceded. Jack smiled slightly. Farmers' pragmatism recognizing cyclical nature of both seasons and human affairs. Blackwell understands when field isn't going to produce profitable yield. Better to harvest what you can and redirect resources elsewhere. The developer's withdrawal allowed comprehensive approach to repository preservation, with all intact chambers now under coordinated management that balanced scholarly research, public education, and continuing agricultural stewardship. The Hawkins Foundation, established through National Archives funding, provided resources for preservation while ensuring historical materials remained connected to communities and landscapes where they had been protected for generations. As harvest operations began across Clayton County, Jack found unexpected satisfaction in how the extraordinary discovery had ultimately reinforced rather than disrupted his family's agricultural legacy. What had initially appeared potential threat to farming tradition had evolved into deeper appreciation for Miller family's multi-generational stewardship. Their consistent care for land had preserved historical treasures without fully recognizing what lay beneath their careful cultivation. One evening, as sunset painted the western sky in brilliant orange and gold, Jack sat on his porch with Rusty contented at his feet. Sarah worked inside on educational materials for upcoming school tours, while research assistants catalogued recent findings in the converted barn facility across the farmyard. The scene represented harmonious integration of historical discovery with continuing agricultural life, balance that honored both Colonel Hawkins' preservation vision and Miller family's farming legacy. Earl Wilson's battered pickup appeared on the farm lane, the elderly farmer making his regular evening visit to discuss day's activities and share observations drawn from 8 decades of agricultural experience. Despite his advancing years, Earl maintained vital connection to farming community and served as respected voice in ongoing development of the Hawkins preservation approach. "Finished my last harvest today," Earl announced without preamble as he settled into adjacent rocking chair, arthritis evident in his careful movements. "Turning operation over to my grandson Michael starting next season." Jack nodded, recognizing significance of this transition. Earl's retirement represented changing of generational guard, continuation of agricultural legacy through family succession rather than commercial transformation. Michael Wilson had demonstrated both farming skill and appreciation for historical context that made him ideal steward for property containing repository 2. "Michael will do right by both the land and the history," Jack observed. "He understands they're connected, not separate responsibilities." Earl nodded satisfaction at this assessment. That's what Hawkins understood better than most. You don't preserve history by locking it away from life. You protect it by embedding it within continuing traditions that outlast individual stewards. The elderly farmer gestured toward darkening fields where generations of both Wilsons and Millers had cultivated crops while unknowingly protecting historical treasures beneath their careful stewardship. These repositories survived because they existed within something living, farms and communities that maintained connection to land through changing times. Museums and archives serve purpose, but living traditions carry things forward that institutions alone cannot sustain. This wisdom captured essential truth about the Hawkins preservation approach. The Colonel had entrusted his historical documentation not to institutions that might change priorities or disappear entirely, but to veterans who would establish agricultural legacies on lands containing repositories. These farms created continuity that institutional arrangements alone could not guarantee. Families connected to specific places through generations, maintaining stewardship that transcended individual lifespans. The Hawkins Center had incorporated this philosophy into its operational approach, maintaining research facilities within agricultural contexts rather than removing historical materials to centralized institutional setting. This distributed preservation honored both historical significance and continuing traditions that had protected repositories through 15 decades of American development. As darkness settled over Oakridge Farm, lights glowed warmly from both farmhouse windows and research facility across the yard, visual representation of balance between historical significance and continuing life. Jack Miller had begun the year as Kentucky farmer focused on immediate agricultural challenges. He would complete it as conscious steward of both agricultural tradition and historical legacy. Responsibilities that had always been connected, though. Previous generations hadn't fully understood their dual inheritance. Rusty stirred at Jack's feet, the dog's extraordinary discovery having transformed understanding not just of Civil War history, but of relationship between past preservation and future stewardship. The Border Collie's persistent digging had revealed physical repository beneath Kentucky soil. But the more significant discovery had been recognition of how truth survives through generations, protected not by institutions alone, but by people, maintaining faithful connection to both land and legacy through changing times. The repositories created by Colonel William Hawkins had remained hidden until circumstances aligned for their discovery, preserved by families who understood stewardship, without fully comprehending historical treasures beneath their careful management. Their emergence had created opportunity for deeper understanding of both American history and continuing responsibility to preserve truth for future generations, who would need authentic connection to past complexities rather than simplified narratives that sacrifice accuracy for comfort or commercial appeal. As autumn stars appeared above Oakridge Farm, Jack Miller contemplated legacy that extended far beyond single growing season or individual lifetime. The land entrusted to his family had produced crops for generations, while silently protecting historical truth beneath seasonal cycles of planting and harvest. This dual stewardship would continue through his lifetime and beyond. Cultivation that nourished both bodies through agriculture and minds through historical understanding. Some responsibilities span generations, connecting past wisdom to future needs through present stewardship that honors both. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.